Welcome, everyone, to the third installment of Riscosity's Lightning Interview Series. And it's my pleasure today to introduce Barak Engel, the founder and CEO at EAmmune, the world's first vCISO firm, and CISO at MuleSoft, Amplitude, Analytics, StubHub, BetterUp, and Faire, among others. Barak's the author of Why CISOs Fail and the Security Hippie, as well as the author of The Crack in the Crystal, the first novel to ever have been pen tested. Thanks for joining us, Barak.
Thank you, Jackson.
So jumping right into it, you work with a large variety of tech companies, each with their own unique security challenges. What are some of the most common pain points you encounter, and how do you tailor your approach to address the specific needs of all these different clients?
All right, I'm gonna start by saying a statement that's going to prove itself to be very unpopular. Um, Generally speaking, the most common pain point that appears in pretty much every firm I've ever been introduced to is that companies tend to either do too little security or too much security.
Hmm.
Which is it really is a repeat problem. Often, sadly, often the sort of turning point is when something bad happens, and then people start panicking and say, "Oh goodness, now we have to do things," and they start doing too much. It's not always that way. Some other types of common inflection points, say, is the march to IPO, right? And then people, oh my God, well, all the people we ask are telling us we have to bring in a full-time CISO, and then you bring in a full-time CISO, and they need to build their department and they have to justify their existence. Sorry for that terminology, but it's true. Um, and it's just that it turns into you can hang pretty much any hat you want on the IPO tree, when the reality is there's nothing in the world of SOCs that actually requires you to do any specific thing. You can IPO successfully without a security program at all. But there's some things you want to do that would protect you from potential exposures, liability exposures, which is really where the thrust should be. But yeah, that's honestly that's the most common problem, is that folks tend to either underdo it or overdo it, but very rarely finding the balance.
Yeah, and so given that startups often have such limited resources, relatively speaking, and they're generally prioritizing growth, how do you think about, you know, the building blocks that you should focus on early on to build a strong security foundation without getting in the way?
Mm. Well, and I wrote a whole book about it, Why CISOs Fail. But fundamentally, you can't think of security as a technology discipline. So when you comes to building blocks, do yourself a favor first, understand what this business is doing. And what I mean by that is not in the superficial level, but get a sense of how the money comes through the door and how it goes out. It really should direct your efforts as a security leader. Um, if you don't understand how this company makes money, you can't protect that particular creation of money, which is what for-profit enterprises are there for. Um, I'm not going to give you the answer that there are any technical building blocks. Sorry, I know you're asking me this because you're representing Riscosity and you're dying for me to say that the problem is third-party risk management. No, it isn't. It can be, and it's an important building block at some point, but really, it's a maturity process. So people will talk about vulnerability management. Great. We'll talk about, software supply chain. Great. I mean, you can name a lot of things. Security is one of those disciplines that is has such a wide breadth, if you will, of things that it touches that depending on where your experience is, you're going to find things to do. If you come from the world of application security, you're going to find a million things to do in application security. And there's so many things that are scary in that world, so many explosions. You come from the world of the older CISOs. Back in the day, were coming from the networking side. So they would find tons of things to do on the infrastructure side. Even
Yeah.
older CISOs came from the world of law enforcement and physical security. So they would naturally tend to go into that areas. The reality is not any one of these things should be a primary, should gain primacy. You need to be able to think at all of it from a higher perspective and understand how you're supporting your own business. Are you B2B? Well, if you're B2B, you have very specific things that are going to drive you because your B2B customers are going to ask you about SOC 2. So, well, that becomes a business driver for you. You can't really help it because you're enabling sales with it, right? If you're a B2C company, sorry, that doesn't matter to you, right? What matters to you, what's driving your business is privacy rules at this point. And it's a hodgepodge, right? The US is not about to get a federal privacy law. So you're kind of dealing with GDPR and CCPA and right? All these things are going to drive you. Maybe you're B2B2C and you have to do both. Maybe you're neither and then you don't have any security requirements, and you've grown to be 1,000 people, and brought in your auditor for SOX, and you suddenly realize, oh my gosh, we don't have any security program at all. All of these dynamics are different between every company. And the goal is to understand where you are, what are the drivers, what are the cultural drivers of the organization, and then you can start figuring out what pain points you could target. But the wrong thing to do is to come and say, I have a blueprint. I know what 10 steps I need to take to make this company secure. Because if you do that for every company, you're just going to end up upsetting everybody around you unless you happen to be really lucky and fall into an organization that those 10 steps in that order are going to make them happy. That's just doesn't happen a lot. And I will end with one comment on this. That is I think the biggest reason why the average lifespan of a CISO in the industry is still less than 2 years. It's a revolving
Hmm.
door for a reason.
Yeah, I love that message that if you're coming in thinking there's like this is how you be a CISO, you're already on the wrong foot. It's so broad, the mandate, and that flexibility is crucial. I'm curious. So shift left, a big trend we're seeing. Everyone's talking about integrating security into the development lifecycle. Curious your thoughts, either how you're helping clients or just how you think about adopting DevSecOps practices that build security from the ground up. What type, what do you believe in? Yeah, give me your thoughts.
Well, first understand what you currently have. Because I don't know a startup in the technology space, if we're talking about that kind of organization, that typically where you start talking about DevSecOps, that doesn't have some people who have had some exposure to security, right? Whether it's the
Yeah.
founding team or what have you, there's some knowledge there. And the first thing, at least I try to do, is understand where that knowledge is being expressed, right? If it's
Mhm.
somebody that has that particular kind of experience, you'll have some controls on, say, Terraform that seem to make sense because they've experienced it before. If it's somebody that comes more from the AppSec world, then they might incorporate a secure code scanning early on, or even management of OSS libraries early on, right? There's gonna be things, and you kind of need to suss them out and understand where they're coming from, because that is already in the DNA of the organization. You can expand from there. Uh,
Hmm.
the fundamentally, in my view, until a company is much, much larger and much, much more mature, it's post IPO, it's already public, it has all the grooves set in, and that is much farther down the road. It's not security's business to get in the pipeline for engineering. I mean, that's the entire concept behind shift left and right. So at the end of the day, you want to enable engineering to be self-service as much as possible around the security of the pipeline, and step away, be hands off. But you have to compensate for that. So you probably want to place security on both ends of the pipeline in order to drive a cycle, right? So you give some controls on the front end that are attempting to catch things before they happen to make it into production. And that can be code scanning, all the stuff we know, right?
Yeah.
Benchmarking, all of these things, but you let engineering manage them, not security manage them. And then you want to have something like a bug bounty program on the back end, which kind of ties, the stuff that has made it and is manifested post production. Don't ignore the fact that you need something to test your assumptions and make sure that those things are handled. But not every company can bring a bug bounty program, right? I mean, you'd like to. That's part of the challenge in the industry. I don't know how good it's being handled yet. Um, but yeah, I mean, you can't. The idea that security has to be the gatekeeper and a blocker for engineering in a company whose life depends on release. I mean, I'm sorry, you're basically saying I'm more important than the company's core business, if that's what you're saying in security. I have to
Mm.
stick my hands into everything and make sure that it's all okay because it's my job to protect the organization. You're not protecting the organization if you're stopping the organization from being competitive. You're harming the organization. So if that's your approach, I hate to tell you, you're actually doing a pretty sucky job. No matter how scary it is and how much you know more than everybody else, right?
Yeah.
Again, it goes back to where security is. You have to learn to, you kind of become the security blanket, right? The comfort zone for everybody else, and you have to be the one that kind of knows how to bite your tongue and not be too disruptive and nudge your company to do the right thing. Sadly, with the full knowledge that if something bad does happen, it is your head that's going to roll. I mean, right? But at the
Yeah.
same time, then you're going to go find another job because there's just not enough people doing what you're doing out there.
Yeah. What a concept. Humility and security.
Ugh.
Often overlooked. Okay, jumping into data security a little bit. Your clients, I'm sure, are working with a broad range of third-party vendors. How do you help them assess and manage the risks associated with sharing sensitive data? Going back to what you talked about earlier, that there's a balance here. It can't be perfect. You have to think about the business objectives and strike that middle ground. Yeah, curious your thoughts.
So data is a funny thing. It's very fungible,
Mm,
right? Um, what does sensitive data mean? Do we actually have an exposure? There's a corporate culture thing that you really want to get into first before you can start assessing this. It's not just about figuring out who the third parties are. That's You can do that. You can deploy a tool. I think Riscosity is really good at doing that, right? It's saying, oh, I can see these connections and this data is going in these places. Great. That is some help. Then you're going to get all this information and you're going to go, with your hair on fire to some big meeting with a bunch of people and they're going to look at you and say, yeah, I mean, that's what we do, or this is how we do it. No, but this is really bad because, and here are all the scary scenarios. Like, oh, okay, all right. So why don't you go do something about it, Mr. Security Leader? All right, I need budget to do these things. We have other
yeah.
priorities, right? I mean, we know that these things happen all the time. This is the dynamic. So I generally like to start with the culture first. Like, all right, ask the questions about how do we generally do we even have anybody who thinks about what we're sharing with whom? Do we kind of have a culture of asking questions or inquiring with folks or even letting them know that just signing up with a vendor because they have a free offering is something we want to push with summer or have ask questions about? Get a sense of what folks are used to doing. Typically, the departments in an organization that tend to expose data to third parties are not engineering.
Mhm.
Engineering does it haphazardly, right? They will use paste bin and mistakenly post a bunch of private keys in there because the engineer didn't think that that's a problem, right? And that's how you potentially compromise access to your internal resources. But the departments that tend to actively share the most painful to the organization, in theory, sensitive data with third parties actually tend to be HR and legal and finance and what have you, because this is what they do. And so you have to engage with those folks rather with the technical teams. And you have to give them a way to care. For example, because you can't motivate people by saying, "Oh, this is scary." If it doesn't apply to their job, it doesn't apply to their job. They're gonna nod their head at you politely, most cases, but you're not gonna get anywhere. So you got to give them a reason to care. Legal understands liability really well. That's their job. So, if you can say, "Hey, here is an exposure, describe it in terms of like the liability you're talking about, and here is a way in which you can say automatically match the data you're sharing with third parties across the organization with what your contractual clauses might be covering that sort of data sharing. Can you sue for damages if something bad happens?
Mm.
Can you sue for damages if you're sharing more than what you're supposed to, based on what the contract you have that you signed online with that vendor is? Uh, a lawyer will hear you when you ask those questions.
In your experience, how crucial is it for companies to have real-time visibility into their data flows? Um, and within that, is there a point, or is there a point in time for a company where like this is where it makes sense to really have active monitoring and control, of outbound traffic, like something that a Riscosity would do? How do you think about that?
So it's interesting. Remember I mentioned in engineering and shift left, right? You have to have the early part of the pipe where you have your controls trying to prevent things from going out, and then you have the back part, the back part of the feedback loop, which is where you're testing your assumptions in actual production. This is that second half in the data lifecycle. So in the front end of the data lifecycle, you have all the things that say, well, we're trying to restrict what we're pushing out to third parties. But we all know that that trying thing doesn't really work very well, especially when you talk about something so fungible as data. So you need to have the backend. The backend is your visibility, your real-time visibility. This is what Riscosity does. I believe that that's what you are attempting to sell to your customers, and it makes sense to me. So it serves that function. It's that they're like, okay, we've made all these assumptions, we've placed all these controls, whatever controls we placed, are they working the way they're supposed to? And you cannot answer this question without getting that visibility. It's interesting in terms of cultural shifts, because the culture of a company really matters. So the earlier you have something in place, the earlier people get used to the idea that what they're doing gets validated, right?
Mhm.
And in that sense, you're creating a bit of a DNA. You're doing a little bit of a DNA shift the earlier you do it. The later time that you do it and incorporate something like this, the harder it's going to be to get people to care. This is, by the way, true for the other sort of back half of the cycle of the engineering cycle I mentioned earlier, which is bug bounty, right? The earlier you do it, the earlier people get used to having it around and to incorporating it into their behaviors. The later you do it, the harder it is to get over that obstacle, I believe. And so you're going to face a similar sort of challenge. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. I will never forget, I had a conversation when I was CISO at one of the many organizations I've served that role in, and we were dealing with a very, very large enterprise prospect. And they were at some point made a statement that I'll just never forget, which is basically, we were saying, well, you're asking us to provide you controls that you should be the one providing, right? If you don't want to place this data on our platform, just don't place this data on our platform, right? I mean, it's kind of up to you. It's an open platform. It does a bunch of things. And the answer was, yeah, but I don't trust my people. They will never follow my instructions. So I need you to place those controls on your end, right? You need to
Yeah.
reject the data that I'm submitting to you, because I cannot change the culture internally in my organization and people will just send it over. Well, I mean, it was a fascinating statement to get from a CISO of a very large enterprise. And it's also something that I think speaks directly to what you just asked. Getting that visibility is to some degree step one, right? Otherwise, you're just doing jazz hands, right? I mean, there's just not, without it, you can't start answering these questions. And the really hard work of shifting culturally the organization.
Yeah, I really like that. It's like cultural debt, like tech debt. Build with the right foundation. It's going to get a lot easier, especially if you scale quickly, as everyone's trying to do in this industry. I'm going to close with a bit of a non-traditional question here. Can you explain for our audience what it means to pen test a novel?
Ah, yes. I love that I can make this claim because I believe it's true. So I wrote the Crack in the Crystal. It's my debut novel. It just came out a couple of weeks ago. Excuse me. And because of the industry I come from, one thing I did is I got a couple of my white hat hacker friends who also happen to love fantasy and D&D, and which is what this novel is steeped in. and I asked them to read the draft manuscript, but putting their hacker hats on and essentially give me a vulnerability report, right? And they did a great job. They gave me some really, really cool things in terms of plot holes that a somebody that comes from the world of literature would never have figured it out. It's not the way that they think. A proofreader, an editor, no matter how good, would not have picked up on these particular cues. But somebody who comes from with a hacker mindset absolutely sees it. It's like plain as day. And of course, as the author, you have your horse blinders on. You won't be able to see these things. So that's what I mean. I got my manuscript pen tested that way, and ended up being really, really helpful. So I think the plot now holds up without major holes in a much better way than it could would have otherwise.
Barak, thank you so much. And for those who have not read The Crack in the Crystal yet, I highly recommend it. We really appreciate the time. Thanks.
Thanks, Jackson.